Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount podcast. I am Shogun, and joining me today for the first time is my friend Frater Animo. I have had the pleasure of talking with him on the Temple Mount Discord server and know enough to know this is going to be a very interesting conversation. Indeed, and to my understandings, we're going to talk about language, logic, Nokian magic, and a whole lot more. I'm not even going to try and summarize it. But before we get started, make sure you've joined the Temple Mount Discord server, and please like, follow, and subscribe to all of our special events on the Roundtable podcast and Temple Mount podcast, which you can find at the top of the Temple Mount Discord server. And always keep an eye on announcements channel. We have a lot of cool events coming up in the next few days. That being said, welcome, Frater Animo. How are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I just gave away my day off tomorrow for overtime, so I have mixed feelings about that. But nevertheless, I'm looking forward to this conversation very
Mm.
much. And you did give us sort of a preview of it.
Yeah.
So I think we should just dive right in. Where do you think is a good starting point for the narrative? Where does it begin?
I think that a strong starting point would be establishing the occult nature of the legal system. So,
All right. So the occult nature of the legal system. And how did you first become interested in that subject or become aware of it? Like,
um, so the beginning of my investigation into the metaphysical and mystical underpinnings of law started when it was pointed out to me as a teenager that George Washington and many of the founding fathers were Freemasons. And so that led me into an investigation to the very basics of Freemasonry. Things like, for example, the initiatory ritual to join the Freemasons is a ceremonial reenactment of one of the master masons preserving the secrets of the Temple of Solomon, even under the threat of death. And other things like that, every Freemasonic Grand Lodge is made to the specifications of the Temple of Solomon as described in the Bible. And that this is a property actually shared with the United States Capitol building that is directly inspired and built to the specifications of the temple of the greatest magician in the Old Testament biblical narrative.
so
And
you, sorry.
no, go on. I was seeing if I had anything else.
So you became aware of the connections that certain historical and political figures had to the occult, as well as the occult significance of certain architecture and buildings, and so you started to realize that there's something to this. Is that accurate?
Yes. And the next thing that I began to understand was the reason why a court is carried out in the way that it is, the reason why everybody rises to meet the judge as he approaches the stand, why he uses the gavel, why he wears his robe and usually his wig, and the short version is that the United States legal system is directly based on the legal system of ancient Israel, and the ancient Israelite legal system was dependent upon and devoted to the ultimate authority of God. And that is the first reason why, for example, you swear an oath to God before you're allowed to testify in that court. And the first implication of that vow that you take is that it becomes a mortal sin, a blasphemy against God, to be deceitful within that testimony. You are bound by the pact of the lords of the earth, and your soul is forfeit if you comply and then try to subvert.
So is what you're referring to, like the concept of Judeo-Christian society? People talk about Judeo-Christian society. Is that kind of what you mean when you say that this is sort of the basis of the law and everything is the ancient Old Testament stuff?
Yes, not just in the broad strokes and the shape of where the law was practiced, but also in the ceremonies and many of the details of the court ritual. And these specificities are directly tuned to biblical morality to the end of exploit against, or yeah, exploiting it, I suppose, fairly against everybody who is subject to it. Everybody must take the oath for their word to be known in the court. Everyone must consent to eternal damnation as per the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not bear false testimony, and you will not take the Lord's name in vain.
Right.
And
Sorry. Yeah, in the Bible, there's only a few things that are described as abomination, or an abomination to God, and one of them is as bearing false witness.
mhm.
So when you begin to realize that these occult and spiritual principles were behind the law and politics and architecture, how did you begin on a personal level studying this? Did you begin, studying and practicing occultism yourself? And if so, where did you start with that?
Um, I had imaginary friends as a young child, and I studied Carl Jung in high school. Then, when I graduated, I learned what Discord was. This was in 2016, I think. No, 2015. And I had joined a server that was for the 4chan image board X, or paranormal board. And I wanted to go there in order to talk about Carl Jung and look at funny memes. But there was a small community of people that were learning and teaching each other something that seemed, if not intuitive, something simple to investigate and to earnestly test. They were practicing things like projecting simple images into each other's heads, which is kind of sort of telepathy, kind of sort of remote viewing, and the manipulation of energy balls as the absolute basic rudimentary form of energy work as a magical practice. So I saw this and I thought, that's neat. I think I should meditate once in a while. And after a couple of weeks in that community, a friend of mine, Coco, had messaged me in the middle of the night asking if I wanted a tarot reading. I was like, sure, why not? So he said, send me a song that you're a big fan of, and we'll listen to it at the same time, and that's how I'll reach out and contact you. And so I played along in good faith. I turned the music on in my headphones. I laid down on my back with my eyes closed, and a couple minutes in, like not very long at all by my estimation, I felt something somewhere that I could not identify with my body. It was like electricity in my spine if my spine was on the other side of the room. It was like phantom pain for a limb that doesn't exist. And my eyes immediately shot open, and I messaged him, and I was like, Coco, what was that? And he said, LOL, I just reached out and touched you. And I mean that was all the evidence I needed to go whole hog, full ham into the research and practice of metaphysics. And I suppose I should say that from that basic directionless sensation, I had applied my analytical mind to it, and I had essentially reverse engineered the feeling And in so doing, I managed to reach back out and touch this man from Poland. And the beginning of my practice was doing that to him about a dozen times a day and seeing, like, more than half the time he would DM me out of nowhere saying, "Hey, cut that shit out." Like,
So you were able to establish some kind of ongoing psychic connection with this person at a distance where you could influence him in a way that he could feel at will, basically.
I wouldn't even say that it was an ongoing psychic connection. I would say more that I had enough skill to generate that connection on the fly that he would be able to immediately react to it and identify that it was me.
Interesting.
And that distinction is important because long-term psychic connections do also happen, but this was definitely not that.
So now you knew that occultism was involved in politics and the law, and you'd also had some experience with it personally to know that these powers were real and that you were capable of some of these techniques yourself. Where did you go next, or how did you come from there to where you're at now? Like, what was the next step?
One of the people in this little occult group had turned me on to a system of Hermetic Kabbalah that was presented to the world by somebody going by Uncle Bearheart. And his system of planetary high magic was intuitive and effective enough for me to rapidly catch on to the basics and begin to endlessly feed on different systems of symbolism in order to generate. I like the metaphor, a set of decoder rings that allow me to derive or invent deep meanings on all sorts of coincidences, which allow me to lend a little bit of credibility to my own statement and quote from a book called Chicken Kabbalah. Chicken Kabbalah by one Lon Milo Duquette describes the core purpose of gematria, that would be playing with associations between numbers, its numerology in its essence. Duquette says that the core purpose of gematria, of numerology, is to get your head so full of these connections in order to get yourself to the verge of a mental breakdown, honestly, where everything means everything else, and your perception is so clouded by analysis that eventually your preconceived notions, the filter through which you experience the world, just shatters, and you have no choice but to directly experience reality without thought or feeling or sensing or intuition to flavor it.
So I'm really glad that we get into this angle for people to understand this. So you said hermetic high magic. Was that the term you used?
It was a form of Hermetic Kabbalah that he and his people, his coven basically, described as planetary high magic. And the way that it deviates from basic Hermetic Kabbalah is that Hermetic Kabbalah will, such as used by Golden Dawn, will still use Hebrew words and the structures of the magics that go back to Babylon. Whereas his planetary high magic goes with the symbols of the planetary bodies, the Roman gods, and says that these encode the fundamental essences of the tree of life. And so they're not just satisfactory, but superior representation of the powers that they're calling upon. And I can't say objectively whether that's true, but it was functional enough for me. And it meant a lot less learning.
Fascinating. So we've done quite a few events in the past that have touched on topics like magic, Kabbalah, and so forth. Drew here does an ongoing series on seminars on magic and so forth. But I still think it would be great to just have an introductory definition, your own definition of the concept of Kabbalah first of all, just how would you describe what Kabbalah really is to someone who'd never heard of it before?
So, Kabbalah broadly is a system of Jewish metaphysics to describe what happened in between God saying, "Let there be light," and the formation of the physical universe. The space in between God saying words and the Big Bang happening. And if we accept that there are metaphysical precursors to physicality, I'm using metaphysical in a very literal sense, in that meta means beyond. So we're talking about constructs or concept that exist beyond and fundamentally outside of physics, and so cannot be fully apprehended by any sum of physical tools. If we accept that these metaphysical concepts are necessary precursors to the generation of a physical universe, then it must be that these same metaphysical processes sustain and uphold the universe in the present tense. And with this in mind, the practice of Kabbalah is setting out to interact with these forces in order to bring about inner spiritual change or outer worldly change, whether by concrete or abstract means. So, in order to give an example of concrete magic, it sounds basically like law of attraction, but things like doing rituals before buying a lottery ticket or doing rituals to make more money, the people who give positive testimony that these have had results give various responses for how these things were manifested. Some people find random $100 bills on the ground, which to me sounds like doesn't really happen in the real world. Some people get like $5,000 lottery tickets. Some people get like significant raises at their jobs. And that is, I suppose, a good spectrum of the concrete versus abstract result of this ritualism, but the intents can also be abstracted into complete nonsense. For example, I was colleagues is too formal a word. I was peers with a person who had made use of the Nokian system of magic to turn the name of an anime girl into the identity of an Enochian angel. And when he had other people summon this angel and hang out with it, it demonstrated changes on their cognition consistent with the lore of that anime girl. I think it must have been a Tuhu or something. If somebody knows the name Madimi, type it in the chat and what it means. But
Uh,
the proposed mechanism for how all of this works is that you are touching on the subtler forces, the subtler causes for which the entire universe is a sum of effects. And so when you're working so far away from the immediate and concrete, there is a lot of room for interpretation, for the meaning to be abstracted before it is manifested.
So thank you for that very interesting introduction. And I guess there's so much we have to cover, and probably it'd be great if we could do a series of podcasts, actually. But before we go to the broader narrative you discussed last time we spoke, could you give anyone just a description of something you would actually, in a concrete sense, do when practicing Hermetic magic? Like, what would an actual session of practice resemble for you? Like, if someone were to watch it, what would they see, in other words?
All right. I'm going to describe the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, which is the foundational initiatory ritual of the Golden Dawn tradition. And so, by extension, it is the basis for all of the rituals that Crowley put together, all the rituals that Jack Parsons put together, all the rituals that L. Ron Hubbard put together, all the rituals that Gerald Gardner put together. That name seems to stand out. He's not so famous. What he did was he founded Wicca. Wicca is an organization that is a derivative of Thelema that sets out to be a framework for reconstructions of pagan beliefs. And so the way that this ritual, the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, is performed is it operates in 3 segments. Let me stand up to act it out as I describe it. First, the magician stands in the east with his feet together. He relaxes his shoulders. He breathes slow, deep, and even. He points his hand to the heavens and he recites part of the Lord's Prayer. He says, "Father, unto thee," as he touches his forehead, "is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen." And as he says those words, he performs the sign of the cross. That would be touching his forehead, pointing to the ground, touching his left, right shoulders, and clasping his hands together to say, "Forever and ever. Amen." Then he stretches his shoulders out again, and he points out in front of him, approximately to where his left hip would be if he were standing 4 feet in front of himself. So the arm is crossing over the torso, and the finger is a little bit below the belly button and at the waistline. And from this position, he traces a 5-pointed star from the bottom left point to the top point, to the bottom right, to the top left, to the top right, back to the bottom left. And as he does so, he vibrates, he recites the name of the Lord, Yahweh. And having done so, he traces his arm in a circle to contain the pentagram and in fact turn it into a pentacle. Then he pokes into the middle of it and throws his arm 90 degrees to the right, as if drawing a quarter of a circle around him. Then he turns his body and he performs the same thing in the south with the name Adonai. Actually, no. To the south is fire. It's Eheye, the name that was given to Moses, the name I am that I am. Eheye. Then he pokes the pentagram, turns to the right. In the west, it is the pentagram. It is the water. He traces the star. This time he says Adonai. And the words are pronounced that way. They're held out because the voice is the direct transmitter of the power. This is the important part of what you're doing, is the expression through the voice. Everything else is pomp and circumstance in order to keep your focus in line. So facing the north, you draw the 4th star and you call the secret name that I don't know its origins. It is Agla. Agla. You poke the pentagram in the stomach, you turn and return facing east. You clasp your hands together and you call upon the archangels. Raphael before me, Gabriel behind me, Michael at my right hand, and Uriel at my left. About me flare the watchtowers, and within me flares the 6-rayed star. At this point, the magician performs another of the Kabbalah cross, which is where he says, "Father, for thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen." And so, I think it's fair to say that all Western mysticism on the Christian mysteries.
Thank you for that. Sorry.
Oh no, I just laughed.
Thank you for the description. That was excellent, just so that people can have a concrete sense of how this is actually practiced. And this has been covered as well in the series of seminars on magic that Drew's done and other episodes, which I'm going to post some of those in general chat now. If anyone's interested, and this will be a great addition to that body of knowledge from the community on these topics. Now I want to kind of change gears a little bit to historical subject. Basically, I think in your thesis, it connected specifically to the French language. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And essentially, I believe what I wanted to talk to you about is Nokian. John D is someone we haven't talked about yet on the podcast, and we totally should do a whole podcast about him. So I'd like you to talk a bit about John D, Enochian magic, and then how it connects to the French language in whatever way you want to approach that, please.
Allow me to preface this by saying that I am by no means an expert on Enochian magic as a system or John Dee as a person. I know broad strokes and what insane people that have done their homework have told me. So,
yeah, understood. But it's we want your perspective.
Yeah, this part of the story is tracing a specific concept of love through world history. In the Bible, there is a book called the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, which is just several chapters of beautiful poetry that is an abstract form of Kama Sutra. It is the love and the sexual expression between people genuinely in love as we modern people understand the concept. This idea of love, this conception of love outside of this book of the Bible is effectively absent from the world scene from like 400 BC when it was first written down through to the 1200s AD when a group of French poets calling themselves the Troubadours produced extensive literature, extensive prose, extensive poetry on human experiences focused on that experience of love. And it is described as a bolt of lightning that flashes between the eyes. And that is a description of the literal love at first sight experience, where you are essentially struck down by a higher calling. And the power that it carries with it is to be relentless if you have to do whatever it takes. And this concept of love is central in several of the plays of William Shakespeare. How does that connect? Right. Before the time of Shakespeare, the English language was essentially a form of German that was pronounced with a lisp and a funny accent, and a few words that we would recognize as English today. But the grammar and the structure and the syntax, everything about the language was still a flavor of German. The plays of William Shakespeare are not written in Old English. They're written in a constructed language that is based on Middle English, I think it is, and incorporates a lot of French diction and terminology. And so this new language, the backbone of modern English, the same English that we speak, was introduced to the world stage in a complete form. And the demonstration that it was complete, that it was satisfactory, is that it could adequately express this specific conception of love that was manifest in the Song of Songs. And I believe this is why modern English replaced French as the lingua franca, the language of all Europe, the language that the nobility of France and Spain and Germany and the British Isles would all speak. And I believe that the reason why the language could only be recognized as satisfactory and complete is through this expression of love, is because English as a constructed language serves as a magical language, something almost intended to replace Hebrew in all of its antiquity and familiarity to practitioners of magic. That English was supposed to be a superior revelation to allow a new aeon of magic to form. And within a few decades of Shakespeare's plays being produced for the world stage to be performed everywhere there was a trace of civilization, there was a man named John Dee who had taken the English language as a magical language and used it as the foundation of a magical alphabet and a channeled language that seems like a very subtle distinction. A magical language at large can still be used as a conversational language, where a ceremonial language is only used for the purpose of ritualism. And so John Dee, who was the court wizard of, I believe it is Queen Elizabeth I, he had received visions from, I believe it was Raziel, the Angel of Mysteries. No, it was several different archangels. And the way that it was proved to them that they were receiving a consistent and powerful teaching is that the angels would show them sigils, and they would record these sigils down, and then they would later be revealed the tablets, the physical structures by which you transform the magical language of English into the ceremonial language of a Nokian. And when they were given these tablets at later times, they were able to use the shape of the sigil to identify the English language name of the angels who had told them the weirdo Enochian language names. They were able to reverse engineer their own cipher, or they were able to run their cipher in reverse in order to prove that the sigil and the name match up with this table, and they didn't have the table themselves in order to generate that. But besides the proof, let me get to why that matters at all. And that would be that the upper echelons of magical organizations all over the world, including Golden Dawn, including Thelema, including some more easterly traditions, the wizards that take themselves seriously and have the prestige to have lots of other people take them seriously, they all unanimously, fervently stand by the potency and the utility of the Enochian language and system of magic. And I can personally attest that even doing the foundational work, which is called scrying the aethers, which is basically reciting words in a language that doesn't exist until you get a vision of what heaven might kind of look like, a couple of those experiences shook me to my core. So, I consider myself a magical jackass. I will do almost anything that I think is funny, but I give the Enochian system of magic the respect it deserves, for the most part.
Fascinating. So, to be clear, the Enochian system of magic is something that this 007 guy, John Dee, this magician, figured out, which involved a specific language that was the language of the angels, and also like a complicated series of like glyphs, basically, that he could use to, I think, summon angels and get information from them, and perhaps also have them do things for him. Is that correct?
Yes. The basic premise of the Enochian system of magic is that the metaphysical underpinnings of the physical universe are angels, and what an angel's name is, and what it does, and the essence of the angel are all the same thing. And you could put literally any word or phrase into the Enochian tablets in order to generate the name of an angel that corresponds to that. If you were petty and pissed off and sleep deprived, then you could put into these tables the cricket that is keeping me up at night with its incessant fucking chirping. And the angel's name that emerges from that construct would would be the metaphysical foundation of that cricket, and would have the immediate power of life and death over that cricket as a premise. I chose something very specific and very petty at the same time because people get weird that way. But you can also plug in, for example, the names of various Greek gods in order to generate a more potent form of that name, something that is disconnected from the cultural meaning, something that is directly enriched by the structure of the Enochian language, and by that means, essentially, add a little picante sauce to any other magic you could think of. And what was the rest of the question?
Well, I just wanted to confirm if that was essentially what Enochian magic was, because that's my understanding. Is it's for getting information and maybe like influence from angels, and essentially that my understanding is he was using these magical powers at the behest of the queen, in a combined role as like intelligence, MI6 type shit, with being a court wizard and astrologer, like you said. So it's very interesting. And have you yourself practiced any Enochian magic? I know it's quite complicated and involves like weird tools and so forth. So have you ever been able to do any of it?
I have scryed a couple of the aethers, and I have had an esteemed associate of mine handhold me through the process of generating a more powerful name for a spirit of mine, a spirit friend of mine, in order to allow for more complex interactions between us.
Fascinating. Have you ever yourself encountered an angel or a spirit along those lines?
Not within the purview of Nokian magic, but when I was getting my start, when I was just beginning to dabble with that variant of Hermetic Kabbalah that I mentioned before, I was visited by what I firmly believed at the time to be the Archangel Raphael. And the teachings that I received from him are still foundational, not just to my practice, but to the way that I interact with the world. And Raphael is the angel from the apocryphal Book of Tobit, the holy physician.
Very interesting. So I have many more questions, but do you think we should open it up for audience questions at this point?
I feel like I failed to connect love and law, which was one of the core points of it.
There's no rush. If you want to get through a little more before we open it up, that's a great idea.
Right. So I believe that the English language was proven to be a valid magical language with Shakespeare's plays, and John Dee demonstrated that valid ceremonial languages could be derived from it. And both of these came together in a of the Masonic state of the United States of America with its explicitly Masonic codes of law and occult tendencies. And the world history doesn't cleanly connect, so I can open up for questions now before getting to that.
Okay, sure. Does anyone have a question or comment at this point for Frater and Animo?
I'd like for him to get into that. The connections, please.
Yeah, so you wanted to connect Enochian magic to love and law. Is that correct?
Not the Enochian language in specific. Enochian magic was honestly just more substance to the potency of the English language, a proof of concept.
So,
At least within the scope of the narrative that I'm putting together. Like it's obviously an incredible practice in its own right, but it does not feature very prominently in.
right, I understand. But your point is about the unique or special nature of the English language. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and this is because you believe that it is inherently like a magical language.
Yes. I believe that because it came onto the world stage in an essentially complete form, and the way that this was demonstrated was by mastery of the art of poetry, and through directly inheriting the poetic tradition of the troubadours who had revived an ancient concept of love that in the modern day is the fundament to all ceremonial magic.
I mean, I'm fascinated by this because I absolutely love the English language. It's like my passion in a sense is like I'm just obsessed with it really. And I
Mm.
agree that it's magical and I have a special feeling about it. But since I don't speak any other languages, I can't make the claim that there is anything special about it. But it seems to me that there is. So I'm interested to hear more about what you have to say.
Mm.
So you want to connect? Where do you want to go next? You want to talk about love, or do you want to talk about law?
Let's talk a little bit about what Napoleon did to the world. So,
Perfect.
Napoleon is a famously suspected Freemason without any firm confirmation either way, but I believe that his dog whistles are a little too obvious to seriously consider that he is not at least affiliated with the Masons. The main changes that were made in Europe as a result, not a response, to the Napoleonic Wars was the destruction of the relationship between the individual and the church, the individual and the monarch, and the individual and his own family. And these, I believe it is self-intuitive to say that these are primary cornerstones, not just of culture, but of one's own identity and personality. And in the wake of the destruction of the monarchies, the old soul of Europa, largely Masonic organizations were established in his wake. And on top of this, one of the Napoleonic Wars against Britain was, I believe it was from around 1805 to 1810, which was a time of a lot of tension in the new nation of the United States of America as it was trying to get on its own 2 feet. And a furious, untethered British Empire could easily have retaken the colonies and done whatever that they wanted with them. And so what I observe is, or my interpretation of that observation is that a major purpose of Napoleon coming to power was to run interference so that the United States could be founded properly. Now, to this end, Napoleon also revolutionized the art of war as it was expressed and experienced in Europe. Napoleon revealed the method of total warfare, and it was by this means that he cut a bloody streak across Europe that was so massive that everyone that wanted any hope of standing against him had to copy his tactics. And so, through his hand in the establishment of the United States of America, he taught the entire world, the entire civilized world, I should say, the art of total war. And I believe that this was a genie that had to be put back in the bottle, because the major conflicts that came after the Napoleonic Wars were brutal cases of total war of Europeans against their own brethren. In the United States, there was the Civil War, which the leadership of the armies, both of the Confederacy and the Union, were mostly Freemasons. That's just a fun fact. And it was, I believe it is still to this day, the most bloody conflict with regards to the lives of American soldiers. And on the world stage, we got the World Wars. And after World War II, the practice of total war relatively quickly was put back on the shelf. I think that the doctrine of total war was revealed by Napoleon, but it was too badass to let the people of the world continue to use. And so the people of the world had to be taught through the abuse of this tool to have had enough of the taste of their own blood, to decide for themselves, we don't have to do this anymore, it's not worth it. And with this thinking in mind, I started looking for other cases in world history where people were putting genies back in their bottles. And that brought me to observations of the social climate of the modern West, where people were almost entirely disconnected from each other, where it was rare for there to be spaces that exist that allow for sincere emotional expression, that allow for intimacy that is not tainted by the basest, grossest aspects of sexuality. And that these havens that still existed were being relentlessly attacked. And I saw the way that love was known in the world become more debased and frankly more violent. I'll cite the 50 Shades series for how popular such twisted conceptions of love have become. And that brought me to a cursory analysis of the character of Marquis de Sade, the French author who essentially taught Europe that it's better to be a vile, cruel degenerate. And usually in his, quote, fiction, there was straight up rape and real torture. And I see that with the destruction of Western culture in the modern day, that these ideas are becoming more commonplace, that they're taking a deeper hold. And that has led me to believe that the idea of love that is taught in the Song of Songs was maybe a genie that had to be put back in the bottle. And that this concept of love that is foundational to the soul of the West, like since the troubadours, since Shakespeare, it has been a major foundation of what the West saw itself as, the romantic lands, it was deeply tied in with truth because of the visceral experience of it, the ability to be completely swept up in it, and change the world through its expression. And this idea of love is also an important magical formula. It's the formula of the Hieros Gamos, or the holy marriage. This is, at the physical level, the metaphor is physical sex to create a child, but as encoded by the tarot Lovers card, which I believe is 6 VI, it is the relationship between the self and an ideal other. What this expression of love is a fire in the chest to actuate a new kind of world. Romeo and Juliet had, in their hormonal frenzy, found that there could be no other life except that one that had each other in it. And that's not a healthy expression of this kind of love by any means. But on the other hand, some of the original troubadour literature is kind of cucked because they viewed the initial experience of that love as even more important than acting upon it. Which, acting upon that love is the meaning of the Chariot tarot card. Is that 9? 9 feels right. And if this concept of love is a genie being put back in the bottle, then what that means is entire vast swaths of the Western tradition are written in a language that is actively being lost to us. And a very possible end result of that is the complete destruction of the Western tradition outside of the little covens that preserve it and the practices of the Illuminati that, frankly, they're too pragmatic to dismiss it for themselves, you know?
Right. Wow. So we've tied a lot together.
Mm-hmm.
Was there more you wanted to make sure you got to in this narrative, or?
The U.S. legal code exists to bind our souls to damnation. English needed to prove love. Marquis de Sade
Can we talk
started
about
taking
that
love
first
away.
one a little more? So you're saying that? Can you reread the first one you read there about damnation?
It was just the opening point that I made, that when you swear an oath in a court of law, then you are putting your eternal soul at risk if you're telling a lie. Like, it's those two commandments: don't use the Lord's name in vain, don't brandish it as a weapon against your fellow man, and don't bear false testimony. The wording of the 10 commandments, of the commandment that says do not bear false testimony, that's not saying that you can't lie to your teacher about your homework. That is saying, if you are giving any testimony in a court and it's not true, you are basically a blasphemer. You are shitting on God's feet in that process.
Right, I see what you mean. I'm not trying to dispute with you, but from a Christian point of view, you wouldn't be forfeiting your soul by even perjuring yourself in court. That would just be under
No,
the category of forgivable sins.
The direct intent of the ritual of the court of law is to have you lucidly say, "So help me God, I will tell the truth, or I will go to hell."
Well, you don't have to
I
say that, do you?
no
Like,
no.
what's what they
You
say?
say, "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God."
Yeah, exactly. So, I
And
mean, it's
so
definitely a sin.
you've invoked the name of the Lord. You are now giving testimony. And so, if you're still being deceitful, you are actively resisting God's hand in this court of law where He is the ultimate authority.
Right. Well, like in the Bible, it says, "No liar shall have their place in the kingdom of heaven. Liars shall have their portion in the lake of fire." Right. So you can
Mhm.
certainly, like, lying is a serious sin, but again, just to be a stickler for theology, all of these are forgivable. Right. So Jesus says all sins and blasphemies can be forgiven, save only for blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. This is an unforgivable sin, and it's the only unforgivable sin
Mhm.
described in the
Yes,
Bible.
and I'm asserting that giving false testimony within the U.S. legal system is, as per the design of the Masonic state, inherently blasphemous. Now, somebody in text chat pointed out that you could swear on other things besides the Christian God. You could swear to Allah, to the Flying Spaghetti Monster, to Cthulhu, but that seeming compromise serves only to bind you by your own moral standards. That whatever you believe in, you're saying that under this court, under this ritual, you are bringing down the harshest possible punishment upon you if you're being deceitful.
Right, and I agree. It's a serious sin, and so enough said on that. But did anyone have a question or a comment for Frater?
Yeah. Do you have any other examples of how the English language is used in our everyday lives, or potentially that is also a binding thing, where they're using the words, the language, to hold us or our souls potentially accountable for something? How else do they use the words English aside from in just like that part of court?
Well, the power of the law is inflicted upon man through the court system. The only other primary place where the English language is used as a weapon against the average person is basically traffic tickets, speeding tickets. Because when you're signing a ticket, you're not agreeing to appear at court, you are summoning yourself by your own authority to go to the court, and at the same time, it serves as a confession. Yes, I was pulled over for going this fast. You are allowed to contest that claim, but signing that ticket in and of itself is a confession, a legal confession. And that's why it is a bitch and a half to contest anything that for a ticket that you've already signed off on.
Are those the only two examples of how the English language is used within the court system to bind us to things like that? Like to do with
I mean,
our souls, right? I'm talking about.
those are the two absolute fundamental parts of the legal system.
Yeah.
And in the same way, private organizations, like the law extends to the execution of contracts. The King's Pact binds you to your labor contract and to the law of the land. So help you God. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. Can I ask the next question?
Yes.
So I guess what are some of the ways that you think, or have you thought about making like this current system better by changing the way that we use like words? I guess yeah, that's like my most base way of saying it without rambling on. I hope that makes sense. So like within contractual agreements, is it the words themselves? Is it what they point to? Is it the way that the words are like drafted up? What do you think would
So
be the best place to look at changing to improve?
mhm. The language of the court system is not quite the same as conversational English. What exists in and for the courts is loosely termed as legalese, and it is the ceremonial language of the court system. And this is also the ceremonial language in which formal contracts are written. And it must be to this standard to be compatible with the ritualism of law.
Can we make a new ritual?
Yes, but why would the U.S. government respect it or take it seriously?
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
I guess,
No, they
yeah.
are the authority, and you will submit, or you will go to jail, or the CIA will come after you.
Thank you. Did anyone else have a question for?
Police.
Sorry. Does anyone else have a question or comment for Frater?
Well, yeah, I was wondering how that ties into like how it's a magical or ceremonial thing. Like,
It's a ceremonial language in that almost every term has a specific formal definition, and the way that you weave these words together, the way that you weave these narratives together, is what determines the innocence or guilt or the truth or the falsehood of any statement brought to the court. Even more so than physical forensic evidence. If your lawyer is bad enough and the other lawyer is good enough, they can bullshit photographic evidence away. The language of legalese is, how do I say this? The language of legalese is the Nokian language, except for the courthouse instead of the universe.
so it's like a parallel thing.
Yeah.
So this reminds me a little bit of the kind of thing Random Guy was talking about with the linguistic contracts and magic of language and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what would you say is the main way that people could start applying this then, I guess, in their own lives? Like, if they had such an understanding, like, are there practical ways this can be used to one's advantage?
Well, to start with, one must acknowledge the power abracadabra, I create as I speak. Even at a mere psychological level, the way that you frame your experiences has a profound effect on the way that you receive it and the way that your world changes as a result of it. If, for example, you got COVID last week and somebody else asks, "Hey, are you still sick?" Instead of saying, "Yeah, I'm dying over here," you should say, "I'm getting better by the minute." You use the magical language to cast your truth into the universe. And if you have the presence of mind to do this every time you speak, I don't think it would take long for you to start noticing profound changes. The
Awesome.
cost of this, though, is it becomes much less fruitful to be a liar.
Right. Well, I think that's a really good practical point to end a really good podcast. And hopefully you can come back on in the future and we can dive deeper into some of these topics. But I think you covered a lot. There's a lot of good information there. So thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for your questions and participation. And I guess I'll just ask you, Frater, was there a final takeaway thought you'd like to leave with the audience?
Yeah, revelation is happening now. You should flee to the mountains while you can. Okay, bye.
Perfect. Well, amen to that. Prepare while you can. Times may be upon us. So that being said, thank you, Frater and Animo. Thank you, everybody. This has been the Temple Mount Podcast. Join us again tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. same time. We're going to have a great conversation with Mr. Crimson about various forms of extraterrestrials and the disclosure of Corey Good, David Wilcock, and Ashiana Nadine, quote unquote disclosure. And that'll be great. Keep an eye on announcements channel, and please do subscribe to the Temple Mount podcast and the Roundtable. Check out the Roundtable archive at the top as well. Thanks so much, everybody. God bless. Let's jump to the forum and see what those folks are up to. Thanks, guys.
So now the people. Here we go.